If you grew up with the original PlayStation or have an appreciation for classic 3D platformers, Spyro the Dragon is likely a familiar icon to you. His stout snout helped launch the first successful Toys to Life franchise, but before he was shopped around at different studios and put through a few redesigns, he represented some of the best platformers in the genre, standing strong alongside juggernauts like Super Mario 64 and Banjo-Kazooie. During the Purple Dragon's run with Insomniac, his series saw 3 fantastic entries, which I actually managed to experience in sequential order during my childhood. That's kind of a rarity for me. Anyway, they all have their merits, but which game in the original trilogy could be considered the best? Depending on your completionist values, the answer could be pretty easy. If you're a purist who likes to clear stages without any backtracking, the first installment will likely be your pick. There's no new moves or characters to unlock in Spyro's debut, so the only thing stopping you from claiming a perfect run in any given level is your own skill. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and take it back to basics. In terms of controls, the team at Insomniac, and subsequently Toys for Bob, managed to make Spyro responsive throughout the trilogy. I think charging could introduce a bit of a learning curve for newcomers, but once you get a handle on the speed and narrow range of mobility, it'll feel fluid. Spyro's flame makes combat approachable from the onset with a spray that's pretty lenient on accuracy, but I think the games are defined by the glide mechanic. Having the ability to cross long distances from the air really opens up the world and widens the scope of exploration. Well, let me tell you folks, soaring around a cliff to discover the route to a crystallized dragon really exercises your spatial awareness. That being said, the first installment had a few, poly-perfect leaps that could either put your skills to the test or serve as a bit of a hassle. The hover introduced in Ripto's Rage gave players a means to course correct and hit their mark easier, but even without it, the level design became more merciful in subsequent entries. That little vertical boost is definitely an improvement over the quick fall maneuver that preceded it. They fortunately didn't fix what wasn't broken between installments, but I think both sequels suffer a bit from the introduction of vehicles. I'm willing to wager you'll have trouble with the trolley in Breeze Harbor, and the seals in Seashell Shore are far from experienced engineers. Characters other than Spyro have their quirks too. Sergeant Bird feels a little loose when taking off and navigating the skies, for example, and Bentley has the camera a little too close to him, which I think was done to give him a bigger presence, but came at the cost of visibility. None of these gripes are game breakers by any stretch of the imagination, and it's clear that the developers were taking the opportunity to branch out to avoid making the experience stale by the third outing. But not every edition felt as polished or fun as the staple mechanics. It's also worth noting that not all vehicles are rough around the edges. As far as I'm concerned, Lost Fleet Submarine and Hunter Skate Parks are splendid. Sparks in Year of the Dragon felt like a fantastic diversion from the main act, too. Strafing around to clear out enemies is a good time, and the power-ups are a lot of fun to discover and execute as well. Clearing these excursions unlock abilities for Sparks, like reaching gems from further away, so players are encouraged to take on these challenges beyond just gathering gems. But let's backtrack a bit and talk about progression. The second game introduced moneybags and leveraged those shimmering doodads as actual currency, incentivizing the collectathon aspect of the game. The balloonists served this function in the first game, but this greedy bear took it further and was sprinkled throughout levels too. He demanded tributes to unlock new moves in the second game, playable characters in the third, and different areas in both. So long as you're completing as much as you can along the way though, moneybags is never much of a hindrance. At worst, he just encourages optional backtracking. Learning to swim and climb in Ripto's Rage was essential for moving forward, but for players looking to complete their file, these techniques would also push them to revisit previous levels to access areas they just couldn't when they first explored them. Year of the Dragon took that concept a bit further with characters, since each level also featured a challenge designated to one of Spyro's animal buddies. They'd always be found in a homeworld from the get-go, so with only a few exceptions, players could unlock a character and start claiming perfect runs in the immediate vicinity. Like I said earlier though, if backtracking isn't your thing, the first game would be your pick. I think Spyro the Dragon also had the best atmosphere of the trilogy. The enemies and music had an ominous tone that I feel was lost in its successors, but that's certainly subject to taste. Avalar and the Forgotten Worlds introduced some memorable tunes and trance-like jams, and I couldn't fault anyone for preferring them over the original soundtrack. When it comes to enemies though, it's tough to beat the first game's mix of Norks and local inhabitants. Jumping between hubs in their levels feels like you're entering different regions of a shared world. The second game nailed diversity and kinda did away with thematic cohesion aside from some NPCs having Alolan forms, and some clever parallels with stages like Zephyr and Breeze Harbor. The third entry, however, seemed to take a cookie-cutter approach that has me kinda split. On one hand, the game having 2 primary enemy types in every stage feels like the team was stretched thin when it came to enemy design. But on the other, some have different behaviors to set them apart, always match a given level's theme through their attire and weaponry, and reinforce the idea that the big baddie was sending her subordinates throughout the world to run amok. While I can't shake the feeling they're a bit overused and kill the thrill of discovery when most of the opposition is just Rhinox, I can appreciate their decision. When it comes to the levels themselves though, each entry expanded on the last. The first game kept it simple: collect gems, reclaim dragon eggs, and free crystallized dragons. It also introduced speedways, which takes the carefree exploration of the main stages and trades them in for active stress fests. More on that later. Levels in the original Spyro the Dragon would introduce novelties here and there to mix things up, like fairy kisses that allow you to burn through otherwise indestructible steel, and featured minimalist boss encounters, but the experience was largely focused on the core platforming. Ripto's Rage cranked it up from there. It introduced talismans to serve as progress markers, but the real advancement was orbs. Some of those green spheres would just be hidden in the environment like rarer gems, but others needed to be claimed by taking on missions. These would be designated with icons over NPCs, and after being brief, difficulty details would be shared. These missions would run the gamut from defeating enemies in an allotted time to participating in events like hockey. Unlike the first and third games, enemies would grant you spirit particles instead of gems when defeated, and those new collectibles would automatically be used to fuel power gates, which would grant the player enhanced abilities for a limited time. Super Flame would let you launch fireballs, for example, and Superfly would enable Spyro to soar around a designated space to reach new heights. Let me tell you, it certainly supercharged the fun. Cutscenes for stages were also introduced, and would play when you entered a level and after you left as a visual reward of sorts. They walk the line between charming and cheesy, but they're a welcome addition that breathed more life into the world of Avalar. The third game had arguably the largest levels of the three, and also handled backtracking the best, typically closing a circuit for players to navigate back to the start from the end, and placing shortcuts around to speed up navigation. Ripto's Rage did this a lot too, but I feel Year of the Dragon did it a bit more explicitly and consistently. It's a little disappointing to say that the third game leaves a bit of a sloppy first impression after the precedent set by its predecessor. Level cinematics were oddly omitted, and some questionable calls were made. If I could point to an early example, there's a cutscene in Sunrise Spring that triggers based on progress rather than proximity, so you can see Spyro and Hunter traversing a part of the homeworld you haven't actually encountered yet. But let's not sweat the small stuff. When it comes to collectibles, the third game did away with Avalar's items and brought back dragon eggs in a way that feels like a compromise between crystallized dragons and orbs. They don't deliver the same level of engagement as free dragons from the first game, but with NPCs littered throughout the stages and delivering world building, they don't need to serve that kind of role anymore. What they offer is whimsical animations and a form factor that makes them easier to hide throughout environments, which is what you want out of a collectible. In another curious move though, there aren't markers on characters to denote how many dragon eggs they have available, and difficulty details no longer appear when deciding whether or not to take on a challenge. The third game also robbed speedways of what I found fun about them for the sake of approachability. The first and second game set them up as something of a puzzle where you're tasked with clearing each obstacle and increasing your timer long enough to do the deed. Simple, stressful fun. I think it was a good move to give a suggestion for how the route could be best tackled for newcomers, but the fact that everything's lined up so well takes any sense of discovery out of the experience and just puts you on rails. The speedway races, which are new to Year of the Dragon, are literally on rails too, and while they technically offer more out of the stages than its predecessors, they aren't quite as engaging as the classic formula. Year of the Dragon kind of feels more like an expansion pack on the surface. I think that perspective is supported by levels sharing a similar flow, helping the locals solve a problem and unlocking a portal at the end, and gem containers sharing their design between entries. But if you dig deeper, expanding the mechanics with new characters and adding in bonuses like speed races, sparks missions, and skate park challenges allow the game to stand on its own. It doesn't feel like the jump Ripto's Rage had from the first game, but it's still a new installment any way you slice it. On the subject of disappointments, I'd be remiss not to mention what I feel is a notable blemish on Ripto's Rage: the third homeworld's lack of talismans. The first two are focused on collecting those trinkets, but the last features levels without them. It could be interpreted as world building, establishing that the Winter Realms don't follow the same traditions as other regions, or even a plot-related call since the final door needs orbs and gives collecting them throughout the journey more meaning. But it just feels like they didn't have the time or resources to craft more of them and opted for more orbs to speed up production. Factor in that there's summer, autumn, and winter homeworlds without a spring, and it feels like content was cut and the home stretch was rushed. Even if that wasn't the case, intentional or otherwise, those decisions didn't do the pacing any favors. Getting from Crush to Gulp feels much slower than heading to Ripto for the finale. That being said, I think the story behind the second game is the strongest of the three. Spyro being dragged into another world while attempting to take a vacation after his last big adventure is a swell setup, and the new cast of characters make for some memorable interactions. The first game doesn't do too much outside of establishing the premise and setting Spyro to it, but the third is a strong contender with its romantic subplot between Hunter and Bianca, and Spyro's quest to reclaim dragon eggs after the sorceress stole them to restore magic to the Forgotten Worlds. It also expands on the series' lore with the reveal that those lost lands were the dragon's original home, and I can appreciate that. Overall, it might sound like I have a lot of negative opinions on the series, but that doesn't change the fact that I really love this trilogy and recommend it wholeheartedly. For any of their shortcomings, each game offers a delightful platforming experience that really overshadows any gripes I've shared. Now that we've covered all that ground, I think it's about time I offer you my opinion on which game is the trilogy's finest. I find it to be a tough decision, but while I think my personal favorite is the first game because of its atmosphere, thematic design, and streamlined structure, I believe Ripto's Rage is the best installment in the series for being a natural evolution of the original without straying too far with its gimmicks. Anyway, I wouldn't want this video to drag on, so let's push my opinion aside and make room for yours. Which game in Spyro's trilogy do you think is best? Vote using the card above or share your opinions in the comments below. I think our Twitter poll paints a pretty clear picture, but wherever your favorite falls, I'm sure we can agree that they're all gems. Hey there, pal. Thanks for watching. This is the first Talk Time video in years, and the format only returned thanks to the results of a Patreon poll. If you enjoyed it, I have a playlist you can check out for previous episodes. Definitely let me know if you want to see more, too. I know I'm certainly down to cover more trilogies.